We are going to the next part of our conference, and our next speaker is Mr. Karim Samji. Professor Karim Samji is one of the leading figures in the field of Quranic studies, and today he talks about sermon styles in the Quran, a form critical typology of public preaching in Surah Al-Hadid. Professor Karim Samji completed his doctorate at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and joined the Gettysburg College History Department in the fall of 2014, specializing in medieval Near Eastern history. His primary scholarly interests include historiography, hagiography, and narratology. In addition to teaching a wide range of history topics, including an introduction to Islamic history, the history of the Ottoman Empire, and scholarly approaches to scriptural criticism, Professor Samji has also devoted close attention to curriculum development. In the same spirit, Professor Samji, as member of International Quranic Studies Association, published a monograph in 2018, The Quran, a Form Critical History, which sheds light on the literary history of late antiquity. Furthermore, it explores the structural themes of the Corpus Quranicum and the literary history of the Quran. Professor Samji's current research focuses on genre history, theory, and criticism. Professor Samji, you can turn on your mic, and I hope that the presentation, the problem is, okay.
Yeah, can you actually see the presentation at this point? You
Yeah,
can, okay. Okay, wonderful, wonderful. All right, and is it taking up the full screen or is it just a part of the screen?
Actually, it's just part of the screen and we can just see the PowerPoint. It's okay.
Okay, just wanted to make sure that you can see the full, you can read the PowerPoint, is that correct?
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, we can read it.
Okay, because on my screen it's a bit narrow, but what is it? It's not a problem. As long as you can follow, I'm happy.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, all right. So just to begin, I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference for this wonderful opportunity to actually present some thoughts on the different types of sermons that we have preserved in Surah 57 in the Quran. And so here we're going to talk about a form critical typology of public preaching. And our focus here is really on, it's really historical. How do we actually reconstruct historical sermons? And here we have two areas that we're primarily concerned with. The first area is genre theory. And within genre theory, there are many subdisciplines. And the two that are most interesting or most relevant to our topic today are form criticism and formula criticism. So I'll define and I'll explain each of these in turn. Then our second area is to basically look at the different sermon forms in Surah 57. And here we're going to be looking at just two forms. The first is the simple sermon form that occurs across the corpus. And the second is actually the imperative sermon form, which is actually related to the first, as I'll demonstrate. So in order to frame the general problem or the general question, let's take a very brief look at the compilation history of the Quran. So according to Andrew Rippin, Muslims speak of the Quran as being written prior to its collection on stones, palm leaves, and the hearts of men. A literary hypothesis for the origins of the text virtually jumps out at the scholar familiar with form criticism when faced with such Muslim testimony. So here we have a situation, as far as the compilation of the Quran is concerned, where we have different pericope or different smaller texts that are then brought together and redacted into the final text, into the codified Quran, and later canonized. Now, this brings us to genre theory proper. So in the 19th century, we have in biblical scholarship the towering figure of Hermann Gunkel, and he is a pioneer in the fields of genre theory and of form criticism. In fact, he is the founder of form criticism in Old Testament studies. Now, the methodological premise of form criticism is very deceptively simple, right? To properly read, interpret, and understand any oral or written text, it has first and foremost to be classified by its appropriate literary genre, its Gattung, right? Let me read this once more because this is very important. To properly read, interpret, and understand any oral or written text, it has first and foremost to be classified by its appropriate literary genre. So this is axiomatic. If this step is actually skipped, whether it be in historical or theological interpretation, problems will abound naturally. So before moving to genre criticism, let's actually take a look at the classical Muslim tradition, and let's look at the classical repertoire of Quranic genres. So we have in the commentary of Tabari, we have a prophetic tradition which posits that the Quran was actually delivered according to a set of 7-lettered genres or forms. The first is command or amr. We have prohibition, we have exhortation, admonition, debate or jadal, we have narrative, and we have parable or mathal. So here already we can see in the classical tradition that scholars are well aware of the generic diversity of the Quran, and there is actually an attempt to understand those original pericope or original text units that the Quran is composed of. So in terms of genre criticism, we see that Gunkel actually develops in great detail how genre criticism actually unfolds in practice, right? He holds that genres are determined on the basis of 3 criteria. The first is formulary and form. So here we have formulaic language, which we'll talk about in great detail in just a second, and also the literary form, right? The second criterion is the context or the life setting, the Sitzungsleben. So here we're talking about sociological setting, ritual setting, the setting in the cult, and so forth. And lastly, we have theme and tone. And there's actually a subdiscipline of genre criticism called motif criticism, which deals with this particular area in much greater detail. Now, when it comes to form criticism, genre theorists, including Mikhail Bakhtin, actually hold that any utterance has an absolute beginning and an absolute end. So everything that is said, spoken, written, and so forth has a beginning and has an end. So there are text limits for any utterance. And that's a very basic principle across all genre theory. So let's take a very simple example, a very straightforward example from the English language. And so we have here the formula once upon a time. Okay? This actually signals the commencement of the fairy tale form, as any child will tell you. All right. So the end of the fairy tale is also clearly marked with the equally formulaic phrase, happily ever after. And if you have children, you know that they know it's now bedtime. All right. So you can tell that we have, in fact, an absolute beginning and an absolute end. And this is easily recognizable to any speaker of the language, including the child. So form criticism actually ends up locating the opening and closing markers that delimit the boundaries of a text, of an utterance. And so this is foundational to form criticism. Now let's turn very briefly to the significance of genre criticism, and this applies across the board, whether, as I said earlier, whether it's historical reconstruction or whether it's theological or ideological, no matter what school of thought you're coming from. So simply stated, the misidentification of a text means the misreading of a text. All right. So for example, if we take the fairy tale form that we just discussed, and if it is misclassified as belonging to the law genre, well, problems will abound. And in fact, this happens almost systematically in historical circles and in Quran studies. All right. So genre criticism is therefore foundational, as are its auxiliary disciplines of form criticism, formula criticism, and motif criticism. Now, when it comes to the Quran, this principle is actually very important, all right? Because the Quran is a historical document that emerges in late antiquity. And the genre conventions that they are actually employing are not our genre conventions, all right? And the other problem or the other benefit of genre criticism is that by understanding the different formulas, the different forms, well, we can actually determine the text limits of a given utterance, all right? So scholars have noted that the precise limits of these text units have long proved elusive, and this is very clear in the commentary tradition. In light of this, scholars have also recognized the pressing need for a catalog of Quranic genres. Right? So before moving on, let's actually discuss formulas very briefly in order to sort of refine our understanding. So when it comes to Surah 57 and the other so-called praise chapters, the Musabihat, including 59, 61, 62, 64, and depending on the commentary tradition, you can add one or two others, but for our purposes, this will suffice. So here, when it comes to these praise chapters, well, there is an exceptionally high level of formulaic density, which means there are a series of formulas that are all packed very tightly into this rather small group of surahs. And this is very important, as we'll see at the end, in terms of interpreting the Quran. Now let's consider Surah 57, which is generally considered a Medinan surah. In this surah alone, there are 8 formulas. All right. These include liturgical formulas, sermon formulas, eschatological formulas, narrative formulas, and in fact, debate formulas as well. Now, let's look very briefly at this chart. This chart basically marks the genre boundaries of Surah 57. And here we have the specific utterance or pericope. So you can see here verses 1 through 6, which are generally accepted to be a unit. And we have here in the Arabic the actual formula in transliteration and the formulation. So we can see that the surah, in fact, begins with a liturgical formula. All right. And here you can see the different pericope or the different text units that are marked out by these different formulas that are attested, by the way, across the corpus. All right. These are not just individual idiosyncratic, formulations. These are actually attested across the Quran. So we have here eschatological formulae. We have, in fact, a series of narrative formulae. And the most important for us today, we'll see that at the end of the surah, we in fact have a sermon formula. All right, and we'll come back to this chart, to discuss aspects of it, but let's move on for the time being. Now, let's turn very briefly to the different types of formulaic language in the Quran, because in the field of Quranic studies, there has been a great deal of confusion as to formulaic language. And in fact, you'll see a number of works that, they fail to, to put it very lightly, they basically fail to understand the different classes of formulaic language. So let's do it very simply. So then this way we understand what we're getting into. All right. So there is a critical distinction among 5 different classes of formulaic language. All right. First, we have genre formulas, and that's what we're primarily concerned with here today. Now, genre formulas actually function as specific literary markers of genre of the Gattung and of the life setting, the Sittenleben. So these are the 2 areas that Gunkel was primarily concerned with. Now there is a second class of formulas or formulaic language, and these are oral formulas. And these actually tend to be stock phrases discourse markers, and so forth. And their function is that of an oral delivery mechanism, and they also aid in oral composition, as is well known in, for example, Homeric studies. For example, if we're taking the praise chapters as a unit, we have, in fact, oral formulaic epithets that occur within this group. For example, and he is the mighty and the wise. And as you can see here, this is well attested, not only in these surahs in particular, but across the corpus. Now, here in this case, these actually function as stylistic verse end closures. However, and this is important, however, these are not genre markers, okay? These are simply oral formulaic devices. So let's consider very briefly the third category of formulaic language. And this is natural language. This is the one that we're most familiar with. These are simply idiomatic expressions that we use in everyday life. So if we take another English idiom, to pass with flying colors, and that just means you did great on your exam, right? And so here, this is just an expression that we use. It's an idiom. It's nothing more. It's definitely not a genre marker. Neither is it oral formulaic in quality. Now we're coming to a fourth category that has more to do with the codification of scripture. And these are framing formulas, all right? And these framing formulas are devices such as archival materials that actually are used to envelop a text within a text. And this is well known, in fact, in biblical criticism, especially in the book of Genesis. We have well-known itineraries, these lists of stations, and we have well-known genealogies, these book of generations, which basically were archival priestly materials that were then divided up, and basically they serve as a scaffolding function in the book of Genesis in order to give it form. That's basically what they are. Now we'll come to the last, and sometimes in certain circles, the most important type of formula, and these are speech act formulas. Now, these are performative in nature, okay? These words are actually doing something rather than reporting something. So let me give you a very simple example. So if there's a swearing in ceremony for a president or a vice president, and they're taking an oath of office, they will say in English, "I do solemnly swear." Now here they are not reporting anything, okay? They are in fact enacting an oath, and that's why this is called a speech act. Now hopefully these five classes, the distinction among these five classes is more or less clear for our purposes. But remember, what we're really interested in here today are primarily genre formulas that mark the genre, the Gattung, and the Sitzungsleben, or the setting in life. Now, this brings us to the second half of our talk, and this is the problem of reconstructing historical sermons in the Quran. Now, for good reason, Gunkel actually cautions against beginning the task of genre criticism with compound texts. In particular here, because he's a scholar of the Psalter, right, the book of Psalms, he's concerned that scholars always begin the study of the Psalms with the mixed Psalms or the compound Psalms. So this is what he writes. Even this relatively frequent appearance of mixed witnesses in the Psalter has greatly hindered genre research to this point, since to the casual observer to whom this first jumps out, it can easily appear as if the Psalter possesses no genres at all. Therefore, he actually sounds a word of caution, and he says one may counsel anyone interested in becoming immersed in genre research not to begin with these mixed psalms. Now, this is very relevant for Surah 57 because it is, for all intents and purposes, because of its formulaic density, a mixed surah. All right, it is a very compound surah, and if you begin with this surah, in fact, well, problems will abound. However, for our purposes and because of current research, since the genres of the Quran have already been cataloged, right? We no longer run this particular risk, so we can actually move forward with a great deal of confidence, in fact, in analyzing the praise chapters and in analyzing Surah 57. Now, before we get to the surah itself and the different forms of the sermon, let's actually look at the form critical genres in the Quran. And you may recall the classical repertoire of genres that we discussed earlier. So the Quran, according to Jeanette, is an archigenre. Now, an archigenre basically means it is an umbrella document. So scriptures across the board, not only the Quran, but the Bible and so forth, they serve as archigenres in the sense that they encompass many different generic catalogs or forms or different types of genres in general. So they are compound by nature. So when we're coming to the genres of the Quran within this archigenre, we see that the Quran, to be very precise, in fact, has a set of 7 genres in total, these larger categories. And the most important point here is that these are all attested by form critical formulas and by form critical literary forms across the board. All right. So what are these 7 genres that the Quran is actually composed of? We have prayers, which in fact are everywhere in the Quran. We have the liturgy genre. We have wisdom. We have narrative. We have proclamation. We have debate, jadal, like in the earlier list, and we also have law. So you can see a great deal of overlap between the classical repertoire and, in fact, the form critical repertoire. And so we can see that there is actually a development in our understanding of the Quran and the different genres within it. So let's take a look very briefly at that earlier chart. And once again, here are the different text units or utterances, the pericope. And you can see all the way on the other side, we have the different genres that are represented by the formulas and forms. So for example, in Surah 57, we begin with the liturgy genre. And in fact, we have cases of wisdom, debate, and narrative. And most importantly, for our purposes, we'll see that the surah unit actually concludes with wisdom. All right, so it begins with liturgy and it concludes with wisdom. Now, this brings us to the different or the diversity of literary forms within this surah unit in particular. So there are multiple literary forms here. We have hymn forms, we have sermon forms, eschatological forms, and narrative forms. And these, once again, are very conveniently charted for us. And so once again, we have the pericope, and here are the different literary forms. We can see that the surah actually begins with a hymn to the creator of the world. And we, in fact, have cases, we have a sermon here on charity, a simple sermon. We have cases of counter discourse within the debate genre. We, in fact, have polemic, another sermon, a couple of episodes that belong to the narrative genre. And lastly, and most importantly, once again for us, we have a sermon form that concludes the surah unit, and that belongs to the wisdom genre in general. So let's look at the wisdom genre very briefly. So scholars have long postulated an analogy between sermon and surah. For example, John Wansborough writes, to the long and many-faceted process of communal formation, which culminated in the canonical text of Muslim scripture, the sermon must have been central as the instrument of both transmission and explication of prophetic sayings. All right, and obviously this is bound to some of his other more controversial theories, but that's not our concern today. But we do see here an analogy between sermon and surah. So let us turn to the formulaic conclusion of Surah 57. For example, verses 28 and 29 conclude Surah 57 with the sermon form, which belongs to the wisdom genre. The vocative formula reads, O you, in the plural, who believe. In fact, the exact same formula concludes all of the praise chapters. This is very significant. And here you can see them actually attested on the PowerPoint. So the praise chapters actually open on a liturgical note, and they all close with words of wisdom. And here, for our purposes today, we're interested in actually looking and investigating the sermon forms as opposed to the liturgical forms. So let's turn to the simple sermons in Surah 57. So this surah, in fact, contains several extended sermon fragments, right? For the moment, we have the simple sermon in verses 28 and 29. And this one is of particular interest to us because it closes the surah unit, all right? So the early Medinan sermon in this case is simple in construction because it has a uniform end rhyme pattern. And it is also simple in construction because it only encompasses a single genre, in this case, wisdom. We have what are called complex constructions, and we'll talk about that a little later. So, as is to be expected, the literary form of the sermon begins with the vocative sermon form, O you who believe. So let's take a quick look at this sermon fragment. O you who believe, fear God and believe in his messenger, and he will give you a double portion of his mercy and make for you a light by which you can walk, and he will forgive you. God is forgiving and merciful, that the people of the scripture may know that they have no power over any of God's bounty, but that the bounty is in the hand of God to give to those whom he wishes. God is endowed with the great bounty. Now, if we're looking at this sermon fragment, we can actually see that it begins with the vocative formulation, O you who believe. And in fact, here italicized, we can see here a series of oral formulaic constructions. God is forgiving and merciful. God is endowed with the great bounty. And in fact, these reoccur across the corpus. But most importantly for us, right when the opening formula is complete, we see that the sermon now moves into the imperative plural, fear God and believe in his messenger. And we're going to see why this, in fact, is very important for what are called headless constructions. So now we've completed the simple sermon. Let's turn very briefly to one example when it comes to imperative sermons. So in addition to the standard sermon formula, O you who believe, the praise chapters actually preserve a second formulation in the imperative, all right? So actually Surah 57 preserves 3 of these fragments, but we'll only look for illustrative purposes at one example of a short sermon on charity in verses 7 through 11. And here, once again, we have a simple end rhyme, so we know that it in fact functions as a single unit in the text. So this sermonette begins, believe in God and his messenger, and spend some of that which he has made you successors. And for those of you who believe and spend, there is a great reward. Why do you not believe in God when the messenger calls you to believe in your Lord, and when God has taken your covenant if you are believers? It is he who sends down clear signs to his slave that he may bring you forth from darkness into light. God is gentle to you and compassionate. Why do you not spend in the way of God when the inheritance of the heavens and the earth belongs to God? Those of you who spent and fought before the victory are not on the same level. Those are greater in rank than those who spent and fought afterwards. God has promised each the fairest reward. God is informed of what you do. Who is the one who will make God a fair loan, that he may multiply it for him, and he will have a generous reward? So let's take a very brief look at the imperative sermon form here. So this is a simple sermon on charity, and it commences here not with the standard sermon formula, O you who believe, but it begins with an imperative formulation, believe in God and the messenger, right? And so this sermon type actually occurs across the Quran, and probably the most notable example of this is Surah 22, verse 78, and strive for. So as such, this sermon actually stands as a headless construction with the omission of the optional vocative address. And this is important because what happens here is, if we're even looking at Tabari and his commentary on verse 7, he simply actually cites a formulaic analog to the sermon form. He basically cites "O people" as the analog, and this formula, in fact, is closely related to the formula for admonition and messenger speech in general. So we now have, in fact, not only the simple sermon form with the standard formula, but in fact, we can identify imperative sermons in the corpus. So what conclusions can we actually draw from this? It's readily evident that form criticism offers a rare glimpse into the framework of this traditional group of praise chapters. Now the praise chapters all open on a liturgical note, that's well established, and the praise chapters all close with words of wisdom, which is equally established. In addition to Surah 57, the praise chapters actually reveal a twofold typology for public preaching in the Quran. So we have the simple sermon and we have imperative sermons. In fact, the typology is much wider than this, but these are the two that are attested in Surah 57. Now, for the historian of religion who's trying to reconstruct the life of the early community, the Sitzen Leben or the Sitzen Kultus, the cultic life of the early community in late antiquity, this is very important because Surah 57 and the praise chapters may in fact preserve a live transcript of a communal service, a typical communal service in the early community. So what may initially appear to be an isolated, fragmentary formulation on the surface may actually go much deeper, okay? It may actually serve as an indexical marker standing in for a much larger performative text in communal ritual practice. That is to say, each shortened pericope or utterance functions as a pars pro toto, meaning a part taken for the whole. To put this point very simply, we have a sermon fragment, in fact, a couple of fragments, and these fragments may in fact represent a larger composition that was performed in a worship service. And so these are actually just simply shorthand markers for, in fact, the officiant. Now, this brings us to the most important point, and these are the interpretive keys to the Quran. It turns out that the keys to unlocking the genres of the Quran have all along been safely tucked away deep inside this pocket of self-styled praise chapters. Indeed, as Muslim tradition insists, Surah 57 reveals itself to be far richer and more complex than first thought. And that concludes my talk. Thank you.